The house rose slow, as if the earth itself hesitated to hold it. Outside Natchez, near the bayou where the air stayed thick year-round, workers laid the first bricks under the gaze of a man in a pressed black coat with hands too clean for labor and eyes too calm for the South's heat. Dr. Josiah Greaves watched without speaking, marking the angles not by compass or chalk, but by fingertip and silence. He'd studied under those who swore by symmetry, geometry, airflow. But this house obeyed a different design. Not one room opened outward, every door turned in. Workers laughed at first, calling it English eccentricity. But as the months dragged on and the walls began to shape something like a spiral, something like a trap, even the boldest foreman avoided eye contact with the doctor. The house had no keyholes. That wasn't a figure of speech, and it had none. Doors opened by pressure, not latch. They clicked softly when shut, as if swallowing what passed through. And once they closed, no one from the outside could open them again without Greaves's blueprints, which he kept rolled tight inside his waistcoat or folded beneath his pillow at night. He claimed it was a safety measure. For who, he didn't say. They called it a plantation house, but no cotton was ever grown on the land. No tobacco, no sugar. The surrounding fields remained uncultivated, dry as bone, while the house pulled in wealth from letters marked with royal wax, British ink, and untraceable names. Guests arrived in black carriages with no insignia. They stayed for days. They left changed, or sometimes not at all. The house was built in stages. At first a square, then a loop, then a second floor that bent backward on itself. Mirrors were placed in odd corners, never to reflect light, only faces. Hallways bent just enough to confuse direction. You could walk a full minute in a straight line and end up facing your own door again. Greaves called this correctional orientation. He believed space could teach humility, that if a person walked long enough without reaching an exit, they'd be forced to look inward, to break open their own logic. It wasn't metaphor. He meant it literally. When the central wing was completed, the workers noticed something strange about the air. It didn't circulate. Wind didn't pass through. Even with open windows, the rooms breathed only inward. Candles flickered toward the center of the house. Sound didn't carry well. Screams, and there were screams, they said, stopped short, muffled as if caught in velvet. The wallpaper was bloodless gray, the ceilings low enough to stoop in. There were no doorknobs inside the rooms, just flat indentations that responded to pressure if you knew how. One boy, a cleaner from the nearby township, was sent in with towels and never came out. Greaves claimed he slipped and ran home. His mother said she never saw her son again, and her house was burned down a week later when she demanded a search. The fire was ruled accidental. The report was signed by a local doctor who owed Greaves 3 favors and a wife. Josiah Greaves had studied under Sir William Gull, the Queen's physician, and brought from London the belief that trauma and disorientation could heal the mind, or rather unmake it in order to rebuild. He believed that children were born too wild, too full of noise. His experiments, funded by silent donors and sanctioned in secret by a medical board that called itself the Quiet Committee, focused on silence not as absence, but as treatment. He designed chambers where sound could not form. He used layers of wool, salt, and compressed bone ash to soak vibration from the air. Inside those rooms, a scream couldn't rise above a whisper, and a whisper couldn't travel at all. He tested these rooms first on animals, then on the enslaved, then on orphans bought from the North under the guise of reform education. What emerged from those rooms was never a child, not anymore. Greaves claimed the rooms were for reflection, that people needed to be emptied of distraction to become whole. But what came out was not wholeness. One girl, unnamed, unaged, was carried out with every fingernail gone, though no blood flowed. Another was seen smiling as she was taken away, but her mouth didn't move. The smile was stitched on, thread and all. Greaves said she smiled on the inside first. No one questioned further. The parlor was furnished with fainting couches and instruments disguised as decor. Chairs with spinal hollows, mirrors that narrowed the face, oil lamps scented with mercury vapor to blur the senses. And at the house's exact center was a door that led nowhere. No hinges, no seams, just a panel of bone-white marble carved with a circle inside a square inside a triangle, Greaves's symbol. He called it the inversion of chaos. It wasn't marked on any blueprint. It wasn't meant to be opened by hand. The room with no keyhole was not the house's flaw. It was its heart. Because Greaves didn't believe in escape. He believed that those who entered should be kept, not by force, but by geometry, by confusion, by their own unraveling sense of logic. His goal was not imprisonment. It was transformation. Every door that faced inward taught the inhabitant something. You will not leave until you become what I believe you should be. In 1860, the house stood completed. Pale as bone, wide as a scream, silent as a prayer that never finds a god. And deep beneath it a spiral staircase not listed in any plan, where the doors did open, but not for escape, only for descent. They called it a house of medicine, but no child's laughter had ever touched its walls. Servants learned quickly to keep quiet, not because they feared reprimand, but because the house itself didn't allow noise to travel. You could shout from one room and not be heard 2 steps away. It wasn't the wood. It wasn't the insulation. It was the air, thick, unmoving, and wrong. Children were brought in through the back, always the back, wrapped in cloth and silence. No one knew where they came from, and no one saw them leave. But sometimes the linen that returned from the wash carried traces, bits of teeth lodged in the hem. Cotton turned faintly pink at the corners, or a hardened thread that had once held something shut. In the servants' quarters they whispered stories over their food, eyes cast down. One swore she saw a girl blink without moving her eyelids. Another found a row of bite marks on the inside of her laundry basket, each mark exactly the same width, all perfect half circles. No child ever cried, and that was the most terrifying part. Not the blood, not the missing, the stillness. The midwife was not from town. Her name wasn't written down, but the Greaves ledger marked her as M6, the 6th woman brought in to oversee what the doctor called controlled parturition. She was a thick-armed, quiet woman, hardened by plantation births and slave deliveries in the middle of storms. She wasn't new to blood. She wasn't scared of death. But when she left the mansion that night, hands shaking, soaked in fluid, she told the butcher's wife that it wasn't the mother's screams that haunted her. It was the child, not screaming. The baby came out quiet, too quiet, no gasp, no cry. The midwife reached for its mouth, thinking perhaps fluid blocked the airway. But her fingers caught on thread, real thread, black, pulled tight through pale lips, stitched from cheek to cheek. The mother died mid-scream and no one tried to stop her. Greaves just watched with a calmness the midwife would later say felt more like study than apathy. When she demanded to know why the child had been sewn, Greaves said only, "He was born with the scream already inside. It would have ruined him." She ran, left her satchel, her shoes, walked barefoot through swamp and dark until she found the road back. For days she stayed with neighbors, refusing to sleep indoors. She said the walls might remember, that the scream she hadn't heard still pressed against her. On the 7th night she vanished. Her body was found a day later in the cotton rows just past the Greaves property line. At first glance there was no wound, just dirt and dried rain. But when they turned her over, her jaw was split wide as if cracked open from within. Not dislocated, shattered, and inside her mouth nothing, no tongue, no teeth, just a cavity burned black, as if something had screamed its way out. The authorities filed it as heat stroke. They always did. The coroner was paid in tobacco and land. No one searched the house, no one dared. Inside, Greaves recorded the event with care. He called it a reactionary release. The midwife, he claimed, had been unfit for secondary silence. Her mind had not accepted the inversion of sound, and so it turned inward, rupturing her from the inside. He believed that exposure to the unscreaming newborn had reactivated the part of her brain he called the grief engine. In his journal, he drew a spiral, then wrote, "Sound is not merely volume. It is expectation. Remove the expectation. You remove the human." Beneath the spiral, he drew a mouth, stitched. Beneath the mouth, a woman's eyes wide open. The baby survived, or at least continued. Greaves logged him as T0, short for Terminal Zero, his prototype for what he termed the voiceless frame. He believed the greatest human flaw was noise, that if emotion could be isolated from sound, true reform could begin. The child's mouth remained sewn for 6 months. He was fed through a waxed reed. The muscles of his jaw were not allowed to form naturally. At night, Greaves played recordings of crying, laughter, speech. Each sound slowed and reversed, bleeding into white noise. He observed the baby's eye movements. He noted that on the 12th week, the child began to blink in patterns matching the rhythm of spoken language. "He speaks in breath now," Greaves wrote. "His lungs answer where his throat cannot." Other children followed. More mothers brought in, some willing, most not. One woman, 7 months pregnant, was found in town hanging from a tree. Her wrists bore ligature marks. Her stomach had been opened but not torn. The incision was precise. Her unborn child never surfaced in any grave. Greaves did not log the event, but one servant found a linen bundle in the laundry room the next morning, still wet and wrapped in cotton dyed with iodine and black thread. By the end of 1861, the mansion had hosted 17 births. None of the children had ever been heard crying. No death certificates filed. No baptismal names recorded. But the servants, those who stayed, said that every now and then, late at night, when the moon pulled just right over the rafters, they'd hear something from the upper floors, not a wail, not a sob, something in between, like breath that had been stretched too far, held too long, like something trying to echo but couldn't remember how. The journal was bound in kid leather, too smooth to be cowhide. A gift, he said, from a grateful family whose son no longer screamed at night. The boy had stopped speaking altogether after a procedure Greaves labeled a softening ligature, applied to the upper larynx through the mouth, using a curved tool of his own design. The boy's parents thought it a miracle. Greaves thought it a success. The journal recorded it as Case 12. By the time he crossed the Atlantic to speak in London, he had recorded 46. He traveled alone. No children accompanied him. No bodies either. Those had been buried deep beneath Mississippi clay. Many of them in the old sugar trenches where no crops would grow. But the journal came with him, held in his lap during the voyage, wrapped in linen and sealed with wax that bore a symbol never explained. A circle pierced by a single straight line drawn top to bottom as if marking division. The private meeting in London was not held at a hospital. It was held in the parlor of a home that belonged to a cousin of the Queen's physician. No records, no press. The attendees were surgeons, anatomists, bishops with scholarly leanings, and two young men from the Royal Academy who had never seen a birth but had dissected 32 cadavers between them. Greaves stood in front of the hearth and said his name plainly. No flourish. He spoke in exacting tones, showing diagrams before testimonials, bone sketches before photographs. He did not smile, he did not apologize, he explained, that was all. He began with a phrase, auditory subtraction therapy, a process by which he claimed the brain could be starved of unnecessary input. Speech, Greaves argued, was a contaminant, not in content but in form. The very act of speaking trained the brain toward chaos, anticipation, emotion, shame. Remove the mechanism and the child would experience a kind of internal equilibrium. We do not hate silence, he said. We simply never learned how to need it. Case 6 involved a girl whose vocal cords had been carefully ligated using a looped wire dipped in an ash salt composite. The wire hardened after insertion, creating what he called a permanent pause. Her breathing remained functional. Her ability to swallow returned after 8 days. She never cried again. But it was Case 19 that made the room go cold. A boy, age 4, subject to mirror deprivation. For 13 months he was kept from seeing his own reflection. No glass, no shadow, no water. He was addressed only by his case number. Greaves recorded his eye movements hourly. At month 5, the child stopped blinking in response to external sound. At month 8, he no longer followed movement. But when finally placed in front of a mirror, he reached for it and whispered a word no one taught him. Return. The boy died 3 days later of internal bleeding. But Greaves did not record it as failure. He wrote, "True inversion achieved." Corpus could not hold it. The audience did not walk out. They did not protest. One surgeon asked if the methods could be applied to epileptics. Another inquired whether the same could be done in the womb. Greaves said the answer was yes, in theory. With sufficient funding, the process could begin before the child ever tasted air. This pleased the younger men. One asked if the silence could be inherited. Greaves said it could, through discipline, bloodline, and isolation. He believed that if a generation of children were raised in silence, unpolluted by reflexive speech or mirrored response, the next generation would be born without the impulse to speak. Concordance, he said, is not silence alone. It is when the body and mind agree that sound is a mistake. In the journal he had drawn charts, not of organs, but of expressions, faces mid-laugh, mid-cry, mid-sentence. He traced the muscles used in speech and placed dark crosses where he believed incisions should be made for optimal subtraction. One method involved osteolabial tethering, where the flesh between upper lip and gum was drawn tight, pierced, and tethered to the jawbone with silver thread. It prevented exaggerated emotion. It trained the face to remain neutral. He called it emotive erosion. At least 6 children died from infection, but 4 survived. Those 4, he noted with pride, no longer recognized emotional cues in others. When shown pictures of grief or rage, they responded with neither discomfort nor empathy, just stillness. Those 4 he called his concordants. He did not view them as children, he viewed them as frameworks. Vessels no longer ruled by sound or reaction. 2 were girls, 2 were boys. One lost both ears in a procedure meant to recalibrate balance. Another's eyes had been blurred by mercury vapor to disrupt visual signaling. All were kept indoors. All survived past their 5th year. One girl, noted as Case 33, lived with her arms bound in reverse position for over a year. Greaves believed reversing natural posture led to the breakdown of involuntary memory. Her drawings, included in the journal, showed humans without mouths, trees with roots growing into houses, and in one, a building with no windows, no roof, just doors, all facing inward. At the end of his presentation, Greaves was asked one question. What is the purpose of all this? He paused, then answered, to end the tyranny of expression. He believed the age of language had run too long, that suffering could be cured not by medication but by quiet, by the absolute severance of expectation. One bishop applauded, another asked for copies. The Queen's cousin offered tea. Greaves returned to Mississippi with his journal heavier than before. In its final pages, he outlined plans for a new structure. A chamber built entirely underground. For silence to complete its work, he wrote, it must be buried, beneath pressure, beneath knowing. The concordants would live there, and what they learned in the dark they would never be able to say, only become. They were never called paintings, not aloud. The servants referred to them as echoes, though none would explain why. They lined the long corridor just beyond the entry hall of the Greaves estate, where the air changed. Cooler, stiller, as though the walls were watching. 32 portraits in total, evenly spaced, each one the size of a door, each child the same. Mouth agape, mid-expression, lips parted as if to speak or cry, but with eyes emptied of light. Not sad, not angry, just absent. Guests were brought through the corridor slowly, Greaves trailing behind, hands folded neatly as though guiding them through a chapel. He said nothing, unless asked, and most were too unnerved to speak. The portraits captured some moment of rupture, that fraction of a second when a scream is born but not yet formed. But something was always wrong with the proportions. Necks too long, jaws too narrow. Collarbones rising at unnatural angles. A bishop from Wiltshire, halfway down the hall, let out a choking sound and collapsed. Greaves ordered he be taken outside. His pulse lacked resolve, he muttered, unmoved. Some men are too accustomed to closure. It wasn't until years later that the truth of the portrait surfaced. A fire in one of the upstairs rooms had singed the frame of a canvas, exposing what lay beneath. Not blank canvas, but dark layers of gray, too precise to be brushstroke. The curator who examined it recognized the shapes. Spinal curves, jawbone density, pelvic flattening typical of childhood malnutrition. It was an X-ray, a real one, preserved fixed onto canvas with silver nitrate and overlaid in oil. Each portrait was a mask. Beneath every painted face lay the skeletal truth of the child it depicted. Not interpretation, documentation. In one, the teeth were filed into smooth triangular points. In another, the spine curled sharply backward, almost serpentine, as if trying to retreat into itself. One child's neck showed clean suture lines indicating surgical alteration of the cervical column, a deliberate narrowing to restrict blood flow, Greaves's own attempt at cognitive blunting. In Greaves's journal, found decades later beneath a floorboard, he had labeled the corridor the Hall of Mouths. Each child had been selected for a different reason: excessive speech, defiant laughter, unpredictable crying. He believed these vocalities signaled a mind out of alignment with its vessel. By capturing the mid-expression and sealing their real anatomy beneath the oil, he believed he was documenting a cure in progress. "Their outer form holds the sin," he wrote, "but beneath it I have preserved the moment they broke from sound." One painting bore no title, no frame, and hung at the end of the hall, where the light from the windows failed to reach. It was said to shimmer faintly when touched by moonlight. The servants avoided it. When asked why, one whispered, "She breathes in paint." The girl in that final portrait appeared younger than the others, maybe 5. Her mouth open too wide, stretching at the corners beyond natural range. Her eyes did not face forward but angled slightly up and to the right, as if watching something the viewer couldn't see. No one knew her name, but in one recovered sketch from Greaves's personal folio, her frame was labeled P Delta. The notes beside it were brief: buried with phosphorus linen, no incision, test of reaction to confinement and posthumous luminescence. The theory was that phosphorus under pressure would continue to emit light, that death did not silence the body entirely. The girl had been placed in a child-sized coffin lined with chemical-soaked gauze. Her body was left intact. No autopsy followed. He wanted to see if the soul, sealed in silence, would glow. Reports from later guests, few and scattered, described hearing faint scraping near that final portrait. One claimed the child's lips moved if you stared long enough. Another said the eyes followed only the weak. No investigation was ever conducted. Wealth, as it does, kept questions polite. The hall served more than vanity. Greaves used it as calibration. Before a guest was allowed into the rest of the estate, they were brought through the corridor to measure their response. Those who looked away too quickly were deemed unfit. Those who stared too long were questioned further. He watched their breathing, their posture. If a man wept, as one did, a French academic who recognized the deformities as surgically induced, he was never seen again after the 4th portrait. Greaves believed exposure to stillness refined the mind. The portraits were not warnings. They were aspirations, his concordance immortalized in the moment between noise and obedience, the point of fracture. To Greaves, each image was a monument to a moment when chaos was arrested, when the child's identity was severed from its expression and a new shape could begin. He believed this was art at its highest function, not to reflect life, but to redesign it. And so the hall remained, untouched, collecting dust and dread. Those who passed through it never forgot. Some became silent themselves, some never painted again. A few ended their lives quietly in rooms with no mirrors. But one man, a junior archivist tasked with cataloging the estate, wrote a single note before vanishing. They weren't portraits, they were locks, and he had the only key. In the quarters, they spoke only in hushed tones about it, never when the wind blew toward the house. The older women warned the younger not to let their children write or reach with their left hands. If a child cradled a spoon wrong, they were corrected. If they picked cotton with the wrong grip, they were made to swap sides. Not out of cruelty, but fear. Because those who favored the left hand disappeared, and when they returned, they weren't whole. Greaves called it the inversion index, a theory he believed could map morality to motor function. He argued that left-handedness was not genetic but symptomatic of deeper neural misalignment, a rotational defiance that began in the womb and hardened through habit. He wrote that the left eye and hand together created a circuit of expressive inversion. Children who used them were more likely to speak impulsively, laugh inappropriately, lie, weep too long, or refuse silence. The first documented case was a boy named Elias, 8 years old, born to an enslaved mother who worked the outer fields. Elias had drawn a picture in the dirt using his left hand. A simple shape, a house with no doors. A house with only one small circle at the center. A servant saw it, reported it. The boy was taken at dusk. When he came back 3 days later, his left arm hung useless, not broken but drained. His hand curled in like a claw, the nails gone. Where they should have grown, there were ridges of fresh pink skin that flaked and oozed. The cook who helped undress him said his breath came in reversed rhythm, as if inhaling through his teeth and exhaling from somewhere deep in the belly. He didn't speak, just stared down and scratched at the floor with his right hand over and over until his fingertips bled. He died less than a week later. No burial. The body was wheeled away under sheets used for slaughtered hogs. That was how the whispers began, the left-handed cure. Greaves recorded over a dozen such cases. The journals locked behind false shelving in the basement study cataloged them as corrective indices. One entry described a restraint board, iron-plated, etched with anatomical grooves, where the left arm was strapped and the shoulder slightly twisted. The child was given laudanum, then small incisions were made around the wrist to reprogram muscular dominance. Greaves had invented a thin burning salve that slowed nerve response along the left side, forcing the right to compensate. In many cases, children forgot how to use their left arm entirely. But some resisted. Some continued to reach, even scream in defiance. For those, more extreme methods followed. He believed the left eye mirrored the same chaos, that it was the seat of expressive betrayal, capturing the emotion the body tried to suppress. He theorized that by altering the balance between the two eyes, he could force conformity, remove contradiction. In his most infamous experiment, he inserted iron filings behind the left eye of a girl aged 6. The filings were mixed with a clay-based compound and injected behind the orbital bone. Over time, the eye would be pulled ever so slightly inward, altering perception. He called it ocular polarity reversal. The girl's screams were muffled. Her mother, who heard them from the other side of the walls, was beaten for drawing attention. When the girl died 3 days later, her body was dissected before burial. Greaves wrote, "Initial failure. But I showed movement toward compliance, a partial success. The servants avoided the West Wing after that. Children were warned never to draw, never to favor one side. Parents began tying their children's left hands behind their backs at night, just to be safe. It wasn't superstition. It was survival. They said the doctor carried a thin silver rod in his coat pocket. If he saw a child brush their cheek or open a door with their left, he'd tap them lightly and say, "There's a better way." No one argued. Some of the afflicted lived. One boy, 12, lost all sensation in his left foot after what was supposed to be a finger correction. Another girl was found awake but catatonic. Both arms motionless, her left eye twitching violently any time she heard laughter. Her smile never matched her eyes. Some said she could see two things at once: what was happening, and what would have happened if she'd been allowed to stay whole. The truth behind the experiments never reached the papers. Greaves knew better than to publish, but his findings were passed along privately to other physicians in England and the southern states. Copies of his work were found decades later in the archive of a Louisiana sanatorium filed under expressive deformities. The techniques were studied, mimicked, renamed. By the time laws caught up, the names were changed again, but some traces remained. In the Hall of Portraits, one child, a boy with his head tilted, is shown with one eye lit slightly brighter than the other. The painter, instructed by Greaves himself, had been told to favor the dominant side. The left eye was made smaller, grayer, faded just enough to suggest it had seen something it shouldn't have and been punished for it. What Greaves believed, more than silence, more than obedience, was that symmetry meant control. That if the body leaned left, it also leaned wrong. And that to straighten it, one must first break what had bent. He came from Boston, well-dressed but dust-footed by the time he arrived at the Greaves estate. Julian Maris, 26, journalist for a northern abolitionist pamphlet that disguised itself as an agricultural review. He asked polite questions, nodded too often, kept a thin leather-bound notebook tucked under his vest. He was the kind of man who remembered details others tried to forget. When he stepped into the Greaves parlor, he didn't ask about the wallpaper or the smell or the air that carried no echo. He asked why there were no plates set at the dining table. Greaves smiled and said, "Some mouths are for sculpting, not feeding." It was meant as a joke. Maris didn't laugh. He was never seen leaving. The notebook surfaced 60 years later, pulled from beneath warped floorboards during a renovation meant to convert the house into a historical exhibit. The curator who found it returned it to Boston, unopened. The archivist who cataloged it read every word, then resigned the same day. What the notebook contained was not proof of slavery or financial fraud or even murder in the ordinary sense. It was an anatomy of cruelty, methodical, intimate, and deeply, profoundly quiet. Maris had written in fine ink, his cursive slanted and small. He documented the exact date he arrived, the number of servants who avoided eye contact, the arrangement of chairs in the main parlor. But most of all, he wrote about her. The girl Greaves called Project Tertia, because she had undergone the process 3 times. Maris was never told her real name. He referred to her only as the Mouth. He saw her on his second morning when he wandered too far from the guest quarters and past an open door. What he first mistook for dental surgery, he quickly realized was something else. The girl lay strapped to an upright frame, chin held aloft by a metal brace. Her lips were peeled back and pinned to the sides of her cheeks with copper hooks. The muscles of her face were partially severed, then stitched back, not to heal but to hold new shapes. Greaves stood nearby with a set of blunt instruments soaked in warm brine. His assistant adjusted a lever that pulled the jaw wider, notch by notch. The room was silent, but Maris swore he heard something beneath the silence, a kind of whimper that didn't come from the girl's throat but from the floor beneath them, as if pain had been absorbed into the boards themselves. She was never fed. Her throat had long since scarred over. Maris noted that her body showed signs of forced dehydration, lips cracking, skin dull. But Greaves didn't treat her as a patient. He treated her as a canvas. Each day he reconstructed her mouth into a new configuration. One day, a wide grin, the next a sob, the third a silent scream. Then he would begin again. The 3-day mouth, he called it, a perfect cycle. The muscles torn and restitched over and over until the body forgot its original shape. In his notes, Maris included sketches, crude, hurried, but unmistakably human. The expressions were grotesque in their stillness, each one frozen just short of life. He described how the girl blinked in rhythm, how her pupils never dilated even in the dark, how her head was always slightly tilted, like it had learned to submit to pain before it was even applied. He described how Greaves whispered to her during each reconstruction, as if coaxing a memory out of her skin. Not to comfort, but to control. "You will wear sadness now," he wrote Greaves, saying, "tomorrow joy, and the day after something no language can hold." The final entry in Maris's notebook was not dated. The ink was smudged, the lines jagged. It read simply, "Her jaw has calcified." Greaves had pushed the mouth too far, too often. The bone had hardened mid-procedure, locking in place. She could no longer close it, could no longer mimic. Maris wrote that Greaves seemed disappointed, not angry, not panicked. Just quietly, methodically let her die. She was left in the surgical chair for 3 days, mouth open to the ceiling, eyes half-lidded as if waiting for the next mask. But none came. Maris described the way her tongue began to blacken, the way her body stopped twitching but the expression remained, a final permanent echo. The girl was never buried. Greaves had her preserved, not embalmed, but lacquered. Her face was sealed with a resin compound, her jaw reinforced with metal rods. She was placed in a sealed glass case in the underground hall, labeled expression number 02 uch. She became part of the curriculum, a warning or perhaps an inspiration. Greaves believed the Yadian project had failed because he had not started early enough. He wrote in his own journal, "Emotion resists when shaped too late. I must begin before the mind begins." Maris never sent any letters from Mississippi. No body was found. Some believed he'd been killed. Others whispered he had gone mad and wandered into the swamp. But the notebook remained, and in it one final line written in a hand shakier than the rest. "If you enter that house, bring silence with you, or it will be taken from your mouth piece by piece." The rains came hard in the spring of 1861, swollen with a bitterness that seemed to fall only over the Greaves estate. The land, dry and cracked for months, drank too fast. The gutters failed first, then the drains, and by the second morning the basement floor was ankle-deep with water. Greaves said nothing. He remained in his study writing as servants scrambled with buckets and towels, bailing what couldn't be stopped. But the water kept rising, and by dusk it was the cook's boy who noticed it, a ripple not moving like the others, as if part of the floor wasn't truly there. The workers pried open a panel long assumed to be solid stone, and the water poured down into something deeper, blacker. A hidden stairwell slick with mold and too many years of dust led downward into a chamber no blueprint had ever included. No one wanted to enter. The air that rose from the space below did not smell like rot. It smelled like stillness. Like a room where nothing had dared to move. But Greaves insisted. He lit a lantern himself, moved past them without hurry. What he revealed was not a crypt, not a lab. It was something in between, a gallery, a nursery for the unholy. The chamber had no windows, no ventilation. It was lined wall to wall with slabs of thick black stone, and set into each were figures. Not full-sized, not dolls, infants. Dozens of them, some whole, some not. All of them posed, and all preserved. One lay cradled in a structure made entirely of teeth, molars and canines arranged in a perfect oval, with smaller teeth scattered like confetti across its chest. The child's eyes had been replaced with polished quartz. Another infant was stitched into the seat of a cane chair, arms woven through the latticework, legs tucked under as if mid-nap. But the joints told another story, bent backward, pinned with iron nails. Every child bore salt across the skin, not caked, but applied with deliberate care. Crystallized in the folds of the neck, the corners of the lips. Some of them glistened under the lantern light, their skin preserved so fully it looked almost wet. Greaves walked among them calmly, naming none. Instead, he explained. His tone was that of a lecturer, not a mourner. He described his process as dry preservation with soul-retentive integrity. The idea, he said, was not to embalm the body, that had been done for centuries, but to prevent the soul from decaying before it could be studied. Salt, he believed, locked not only flesh but essence. Moisture invites forgetting, he wrote later. Salt remembers. The infants had not died in a uniform manner. Some showed signs of surgical dissection, clean, deliberate incisions at the belly or the base of the spine. One had the skin of the back peeled and stretched like parchment against the wall, pinned with ivory needles. Another had a cavity opened beneath the ribs and filled with silver thread. Greaves believed that emotions formed in physical patterns, and that by preserving those shapes at the moment of death, he could study their residue. One particularly small child, no more than 6 pounds, had salt crystals embedded into the tongue. Greaves had written beside her in chalk, attempted speech retention, failure. What disturbed the workers most wasn't the condition of the children. It was the silence of the room. No echoes, no footsteps, no breath. The cellar swallowed all sound, not like an absence, but like a hunger. A space so deeply emptied it fed on noise. One man dropped his pail and fled. Another stood frozen, staring at the infant in the chair until Greaves ordered him out. Only the cook's boy stayed, unwilling or unable to look away. He asked a single question, voice barely audible. Why? Greaves turned, lantern in hand, and said plainly, because they were almost whole. In his private journals, recovered years later beneath floor joists stained with age, Greaves outlined his theory in full. He believed that infants, unlike older children, hovered closer to silence, that their minds were not yet infected by language or ego. If kept quiet long enough, Their souls might be captured mid-formation like mist sealed in a bottle. The salt wasn't just for decay prevention. It was, in his words, a preservative of potential. These children were not mistakes, they were models. He hoped one day the process would be legalized, that science would, as he put it, catch up to necessity. By the next day, the room was sealed again. Greaves had the entrance bricked over, layer by layer, as if nothing had ever been found. The workers were paid extra and sent away, one to Arkansas, another to New Orleans. The cook's boy vanished. Some said he was taken to the underground ward. Others said he ran into the river that same night and never surfaced. The chair he saw, the one with the infant stitched into it, was never mentioned again. But one note in Greaves's files listed it plainly. Concordant seating model Gen Alpha requires less restraint than anticipated. The cellar became legend then myth, but salt never left the walls. Years later, when rains returned and flooded the house again, the air filled with the scent of brine. A carpenter found his boots rimmed with it. A visitor sneezed blood after standing near the old basement door. But no one reopened it. No one wanted to see what remained. They found him barefoot outside a butcher's stall in Vermilion Parish, Louisiana, in the summer of 1873. Elijah, aged 11, skin blistered from sun and salt, lips cracked but silent. He carried no name, no paper, no memory that anyone could reach. He wouldn't speak, wouldn't blink, wouldn't eat unless the food was placed precisely at the center of a plate. When taken in by the local parish doctor, he slept with his spine pressed flat against the wooden floorboards and his hands curled tight behind his back, as if still bound. They thought he was another escaped orphan from the Delta rail line, until one evening he began to make sounds. It wasn't speech, not at first, just syllables soft and slurred, repeated fragments, then words. Then full sentences but wrong, reversed, played backward as if someone had wound a record in reverse. At first it was dismissed as nonsense, a trauma response, but when a school teacher listened closely, she dropped her pen and refused to return. The boy wasn't just speaking backwards, he was mimicking someone, word for word, voice for voice, a man, calm, precise, and British. The words came with unnatural fluency, the intonation too exact for a child. When recorded phonetically and reversed by a phonologist in Baton Rouge, the meaning snapped into place. There must be 12, each one opened where thought begins. The phrases were cold, measured, clinical. Transcripts were sent to a neurologist who noticed a repeated phrase that unsettled him. The spine remembers what the soul discards. Elijah spoke only in the evenings after dusk and always in that same reversed cadence. Witnesses claimed it wasn't a boy speaking. It was a man living inside a boy's mouth. After 3 nights of transcription, the doctors realized the voice had named himself once Greaves. The boy was speaking the words of Dr. Josiah Greaves, or more disturbingly, replaying them. Like a recording embedded not in memory but in the body. A trauma echo, some said. Others whispered something else, that perhaps he hadn't escaped Greaves. That perhaps Greaves had survived in him. Elijah was moved to a sanatorium in Shreveport where physicians hoped to isolate the cause of his speech. They found scarring along his spine, 12 punctures perfectly aligned, 1 at each vertebra. The tissue around the sites had hardened unnaturally, Further inspection revealed evidence of what one surgeon described as systematic spinal tapping, a procedure he'd only seen mentioned in obscure French journals on battlefield experiments. Elijah's spinal fluid had been accessed repeatedly, harvested, and according to the transcripts, he had not been alone. 12 children, the voice had said, must be made to unstring themselves so the circuit may complete. This phrase appeared 3 times, always after a moment of silence, as though marking a rule, a ritual. Greaves had called it the concordant loop, a closed system of human nervous tissue, harvested and modified to create a continuous controlled flow of energy. Not electricity, not thought, something else, something emotional. Trauma refines the charge, the voice had said. Only the broken can conduct the current. The boy had been one of the 12, perhaps the final one, perhaps the only one to survive. His back bore the proof. His eyes, mismatched in dilation, refused to focus unless light was flickering. He blinked in sets of 3, always 3, and he never answered questions unless they were phrased as commands. After 5 days in the sanatorium, he vanished. No signs of struggle, no broken locks. His bed was still made, but at the foot of the mattress they found the last page of the phonetic transcription. His final reversed utterance, written not in ink but burned into the sheet with salt water and heat. A brand almost. It read, "If the loop is broken, the remainder will decay." Beneath it, a symbol was etched with a fingernail into the wood, a circle surrounded by 12 marks. The same shape found in Greaves's journals, the same number of children recorded missing. In later years, unsealed documents would confirm a pattern of disappearances in counties surrounding the Greaves estate between 1860 and 1863. All children, all under the age of 12. Most from families no one would miss. Freed slaves, laborers, orphans, daughters of laundresses and midwives. No charges were filed. The few that investigated met sudden ends. A deputy drowned in a dry well. A sheriff took his own life, leaving behind a single phrase scrawled on his wall. The boy who hums backwards. Whispers of Elijah continued. A school teacher in Arkansas claimed a child appeared during a thunderstorm, mouthing words in reverse to her infant son. A blind preacher in Texas claimed the same child sat in his pews, humming with each bolt of lightning. In every story, the boy left no footprints. In every story, he said nothing a child should know. Those who heard the recordings, the preserved phonographs, often complained of headaches, nausea, or a sense that they were being watched by something inside themselves. The tapes were locked away, lost or destroyed, but the words remained in archives, some official, others tucked between pages of private letters never meant to be read aloud. Because some believed that Greaves had created more than a loop. He had created a vessel, that by breaking children open he had emptied himself into them. And Elijah, the last, was his echo made flesh. The fire came without warning, but also without light. On a cold morning in February 1874, a neighbor saw steam rising from the Greaves estate, but no flames. The windows were gray, the shutters closed. The house looked the same as always, silent, smug, unspeaking. But when a farmhand finally approached around noon, he felt the heat before he reached the porch. His boots stuck to the warped boards. His nose filled, not with the sharp tang of burning wood, but something duller, fat hair, parchment. The door opened too easily. Inside, the air shimmered like it was still burning, but there was no fire, just smoke that didn't rise, didn't drift. It hung in shapes, strange columned shapes, each the length of a child. And in the walls, the ceiling, even the floorboards, black patterns like vines or symbols, but clearer the longer you looked. Vertebrae, over and over, spines etched in soot. Not a single ember touched the outer walls. The columns were intact, the shingles unburned. From the road, the house looked untouched by violence. But every hallway inside was blackened from within, not uniformly, selectively. The parlor where Greaves had hosted his silent guests was scorched in a perfect oval. The portraits on the walls burned through exactly at the mouths, leaving behind rows of eyeless, screaming silence. The basement staircase had collapsed, revealing beneath it the edge of a room no one knew existed, the stone steps leading into a chamber so charred it looked like it had always been ash. 11 spines were found in total, not full bodies, only spines. No skulls, no ribs, just vertebral columns, each meticulously arranged in a line against the east hallway wall. One set smaller than the rest curled into itself as if resisting even in death. No two were the same length. The bones were cleaned of flesh, yet bore no signs of cutting, as if the fire had peeled everything else away with surgical restraint. Investigators from the parish were called in. They lasted hours. Some refused to enter the second floor, others wept. One man went still when he saw the faint traces of spinal ash spiraling up the walls. He whispered. They tried to stand. In the master bedroom, the only untouched space, a single chair rocked gently on the clean wooden floor. Beside it stood a mirror, unburned, unstained. No footprints around it, no soot, nothing. The mirror reflected only the chair, not the door, not the walls, not even the man who stepped in to photograph it. His camera jammed. He never returned. When he developed the plates, the only thing visible was a faint outline behind the glass, like smoke caught in the act of forming a shape. No body was ever found for Dr. Josiah Greaves. Theories spread quickly that he had escaped, that he had faked his death, that he had been consumed not by fire but by his own experiment. One investigator's notes, never published, referenced a theory taken from Greaves's journals. The concordant loop must end with an inversion. In his last entries, Greaves had speculated that 12 children, when stripped of voice and spinal alignment, could form not just a metaphysical circuit, but a combustible one, emotional current made physical, a loop bound by silence and pain. He wrote of spinal tension stored beyond tolerable yield. He warned of a threshold. He did not mark what that threshold was. When authorities finally catalogued the remains, they noted something strange. All 11 spines bore signs of internal pressure, bone fractures that radiated from the inside out, as if the fire hadn't touched them but emerged from within. One vertebra had cracked clean in half but showed no sign of heat warping. It looked split, not burned. The estate was razed 2 weeks later. The official cause of fire, unknown electrical origin. A meaningless claim in a house with no wiring. A memorial was proposed by a group of physicians who wanted to preserve Greaves's research. It was denied. Quietly, local families began marking their doors with salt. No one moved into the land again. Even the grass stopped growing in the foundation's shape, an outline always visible, always cold. Some believed the fire was justice. Others believed it was a reaction, that the loop had turned inward. that when the 12th spine was never added, Elijah's, the structure imploded, no longer balanced. That the concordant loop, incomplete, had tried to correct itself. The mirror was removed from the estate before the demolition. It was taken to a private collection in New York, where it sat untouched for decades. In 1927, a restorer reported finding faint impressions behind the glass, like fingerprints dragged from the inside. When photographed, the image captured a rocking chair in mid-motion, though none had been placed nearby. The curator died 2 days later from sudden spinal hemorrhage. The mirror was sealed. No written will for Greaves was ever found. But one note, unsigned, was discovered beneath a scorched floorboard in the surgical hall. It read, "If they break their backs to make silence, and silence breaks in return, who speaks then?" 2 years after the fire that left no scorch marks on the outer walls, a law passed quietly through the Mississippi legislature. It bore no names, no accusations, no mention of the house near Natchez or the physician who vanished without a trace. But every architect understood. The Institutional Design Regulation Act of 1876 required that all internal doors in schools, hospitals, asylums, and private care homes must provide access to egress or external ventilation. No more inward-only chambers, no more sealed interiors, no more corridors that led nowhere but deeper inside. The law passed unanimously. No debate, no delay. As if everyone already knew what had been done. The language was cold and clean. For the safety and psychological stability of wards and residents. It cited nothing. But between its lines, those who'd heard the stories saw them written in ash. Inspectors were dispatched to old properties. Dozens of private homes for children and the ill were shuttered overnight. Some claimed the act was about fire safety. Others whispered it was to keep something from happening again. Though none said exactly what. The word Greaves did not appear once in the state's records. But his work didn't vanish. It simply changed hands. By the 1890s, fragments of his notes, disconnected from his name, surfaced in early child psychiatry publications printed in New York and Edinburgh. Ideas about silence as correction, posture as moral alignment, sensory deprivation as therapeutic reset. They were dressed in new language, behavioral hygiene, restorative non-stimulation, oral inversion. One journal published a paper on mirror fasting, prescribing the removal of all reflective surfaces for disobedient children. Another endorsed upright sleeping restraints to encourage vertebral humility. The authors never referenced where these methods came from, but those who had walked the hallways of the Greaves estate recognized the blueprints. In the 1930s, military programs in the United States and Britain began experimenting with silence as a tool, not for healing but for interrogation. Cells with no echo, walls that swallowed breath, chairs molded to prevent speech. One declassified training manual refers obliquely to pre-validated techniques from 19th century developmental correctional trials. In the margin, a pencil sketch of a chair shaped like a rib cage. The footnote reads, "Mouth neutralization required for subject stability." The house itself was long gone, but the design lived on, in walls that didn't let voices bounce, in institutions built for stillness, in facilities where silence wasn't absence, but policy. In 1983, over a century after the fire, a plaque was placed on the edge of the land where the Greaves estate once stood. It didn't list his name. It didn't describe the children or the chair or the salted cellar. It simply read, "For those whose doors were turned inward." Locals visited it in the first week, standing without speaking. A few left flowers. A teacher from nearby scratched a small message into the stone. We didn't hear them. We still don't. The message was scrubbed off by city workers the following morning. In academic circles, Greaves's name now appears rarely, and when it does, it's paired with caution. A fringe medical theorist, a precursor to institutional restraint science, a misunderstood architect of behavioral space. But none use the word many still whisper, monster, because to name him, that would be to indict the systems that inherited his silence, and systems do not indict themselves. In recent years, survivors of mid-century orphanages and sanatoria have described rooms eerily similar to Greaves's design. One former resident of a Kentucky state home described being forced to sleep in a bed shaped like a question mark. Her back arched until her breath changed tempo. Another recalled mood readings taken through the pressure of their spinal alignment. Each of these methods was attributed to old medical doctrine. None had authors. Silence was never just a method, it was a goal. Greaves did not want to mute children. He wanted to mold them into figures who would not cry, speak, or disobey, into vessels that held nothing but stillness. The house he built was not meant to contain. It was meant to convert. Every inward door, every mirrorless hallway, every windowless room was a sermon preached in design. A message carved in architecture. You may come in loud, but you will leave quiet, or not at all. And yet, in the end, the silence he created became unstable. The concordant loop, incomplete, broke. The children turned inward, then ignited. The spines remained when the name did not. Today, hospitals have egress codes. Schools must provide natural light. Therapy offices must echo. These are not just policies, they are safeguards against a design that once believed silence was salvation. Some say Greaves was a pioneer. Others call him a prophet of silence. But silence is a kind of violence, and those who institutionalize it sanctify it. What begins as medicine can become method. What hides behind a closed door may be facing the wrong way. What do you think? Could this happen again? Or has it never truly stopped?